Welcome to the Simple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. I'm your host, Shannon Ables, and whether you're listening on your commute, exercising, working in the garden, or sitting down with a hot cup of tea or a cafe au lait, thank you for tuning in. Let's get started. Welcome to the Simple Sophisticate and episode 140. Today we're going to be talking about something I mentioned last week on the Why Not post on Wednesday. We were talking about why not create a to-be list, and I listed 22 different things on my list of things I was trying to be each day. And one of those items, while I was able to share with you links to all 21 items, there was one item I hadn't actually written or researched and shared here on the podcast or on the blog. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And that is emotional intelligence, otherwise known as your EQ. We're going to dive deep into that concept today. We're going to talk about, number one, what it is, number two, what the benefits are, and number three, how to improve your emotional intelligence. But before we get to that, I want to give you a sneak peek at what today's petit plaisir is. We are going to talk about something I think a lot of us are craving with regards to winter. And if you're anywhere in Oregon or anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, you've been experiencing a more intense winter than normal. And I know the East Coast has as well and across the middle of the country. But even if you're not experiencing winter, we're going to talk about something that's equally powerful no matter what season it is, and something that you can do, and it's very, very inexpensive. So stay tuned at the end of today's episode where I'll talk about this simple luxury. But now let's get to today's topic. Emotional intelligence, a crucial tool for enhancing quality in life and work. I want to begin with a quote that I found on another blog called Life Altering Awareness, and they shared this concept or this idea. Life circumstances have little to do with happiness because much happiness is under your control, the product of your habits and your outlook on life. Happiness is synthetic. You either create it or you don't. And I chose that quote because emotional intelligence is a skill. It is something we can build up. It is something we can become better at and incorporate into our lives. It is not something we are born with. And I think that's an amazing opportunity that we can really latch onto and improve the quality of our lives, whether we are at work or whether in our relationships at home, in our personal life. So the uncertainties, as we know in life, are vast. And we've talked about that before on the blog. I shared 10 different ways that content people deal with uncertainty in their lives, and I'll share a link to that post. But it's true, there are so many unknowns and things that we cannot control. But to errantly ignore the ability to master the certainties is a mistake. Each of us is capable of cultivating a life that is fulfilling and attains true contentment no matter what changes life may bring by honing the tool of emotional intelligence. Now, this term was created by researchers Peter Salavoy and John Mayer, and it was brought more into the mainstream culture by Dan Goleman in his 1996 book titled Emotional Intelligence. So EQ is often the detail that we forget about that often tends to make a most significant difference in the quality of our lives, no matter what the circumstances may be. And the beauty is, each of us has the ability to improve our EQ. So what exactly is emotional intelligence? You may have heard of the term. You may have even read about it a while ago, and you just need to be reminded of it. Now, it's often broken down into three components, and I'll share with you those here. So, number one, it involves emotional awareness, including the ability to define or identify your own emotions and those of others. Number two, the ability to harness emotions and apply them to tasks, like thinking and problem solving. And the third one is the ability to manage your emotions, including the ability to regulate your own emotions and the ability to cheer up or calm down another person. Now, I'd like to look at it another way as well. So, those are the three general components, but emotional intelligence can be divided into two components: the personal and the social. There are four abilities one will exhibit if they have a high emotional intelligence. So, there's two in personal and there's two in the social category. So, the two that are in personal are being self aware and having good self management. And in the social component, it's social awareness and relationship management. So if we really want to look at it in that lens, I think that for me anyway, it's helpful because it's almost like a yin and yang. You have to be able to master yourself and be aware of yourself. But at the same time, to be truly emotionally intelligent, you also have to have the social component and manage and effectively be aware of people and surroundings outside of you. At the foundation of developing a strong emotional IQ or emotional intelligence, the EQ, is the awareness of a balance that is often discussed here on this podcast and on the blog, The Simply Luxurious Life. Exploring and understanding ourselves, whilst respectfully and thoughtfully navigating the world around us, whether in work or play, is when we look at what our lives are all about, what living well should be all about. Striking a healthy balance between ourselves and the relationships we build, and ensuring the relationships we built with ourselves and others are healthy, respectful, thoughtful, loving, and kind. So, emotional intelligence is simple in theory. They're not difficult concepts to understand, but when we put them in practice, initially it's difficult. It will take time, it will take attention, and it will take patience to build a muscle that may not have been worked in quite some time or ever. Now, as you're going to see in the items we're going to discuss here in a moment, there are many different characteristics that an emotionally intelligent person embodies. And I highly recommend you take an EQ test, and I provide two links to online tests. There's a short version, which is it's simple. I took this one as well as the long one. This one gives you the exact same feedback that you're going to need to get started. But if you want more in depth, I want to take more time really examining, I have a long version as well. And it will hopefully help you determine your strengths and weaknesses because many of us are proficient in some of the areas of emotional intelligence, but we may either be conscious or unconsciously weak in others. And that's what we need to figure out. So, with any eventual success, the first towards improving is knowing where we need to improve. We want to know where that crack is and fix it where it actually exists rather than where we think it is. And it's not where there's a problem and the other crack just gets worse and worse and worse, and a bigger amount of water keeps coming through that wall. So, that's what we're trying to figure out today. That's what hopefully you'll start with when you take those tests, is to figure out where your weaknesses and strengths are. And for those strengths that you realize you have, pat yourself on the back for doing well already, because that's significant, just acknowledging and being aware of that. Sometimes we don't even realize that that's a skill that's helping us make our lives better. But just as important as it is to know our weaknesses, it's important to know our strengths as well. And often we need to focus on those strengths to make them even stronger. And sometimes we forget to do that. But first, let's look at the carrot. In other words, let's look at what the benefits are of bolstering our emotional intelligence. What can we gain by improving our EQ? And here's a long list. And I have these all on the show notes, the simplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 140. But let's start at the top. Number 1, you become the curator of your own happiness, regardless of outside forces, events, or people. You begin to solve a variety of emotional related problems accurately and quickly. You can accurately perceive emotions in faces of those around you. You begin to manage emotions effectively, both your own and others, especially when you are under pressure. So, for example, you're able to regulate emotions such as anger or jealousy and keep them at a healthy level and recognize what you're feeling, understand why. It doesn't mean you're not going to feel all the variety of emotions, good and bad. It just means you're going to be able to label them, observe them accurately, understand their triggers, and then regulate them so you can keep them at a healthy level and determine whether or not you should talk to whoever has helped bolster that emotion, good or bad, or if it's just something, nope, I'm okay. Let's keep moving forward and just not deal with it, because it might not be something that you need to address with someone else, but instead you need to address with yourself. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in today's episode. So those are 4 benefits and characteristics. We have a few more. You're also going to be able to calmly find solutions to problems. You're going to begin to exude confidence due to trusting your intuition and not allowing emotions to get out of control. You will become more self-aware. You will be able to look honestly at yourself, observe your strengths and weaknesses, and be able to work on areas where you can improve. You will also become comfortable with change, whether that's change that you initiate or that's unexpected. You will gain more strength in the ability to say no when you need to say no. You will begin to exemplify more sincere thoughtfulness. We'll talk about what that may look like a little bit later in today's episode. You'll become more disciplined and therefore can discern between immediate and long-term effects of your actions. Thereby, you will begin to experience more success, more effectiveness, and more productivity. Your listening skills will improve. You will be less likely to judge and stereotype. You will begin to manage relationships well. You will begin to be able to identify with and understand the wants, needs, and viewpoints of those around you. And lastly, you will begin to manage disputes effectively. You'll become more effective at communicating with others in groups at work or at home, and you'll become astute at building and maintaining relationships. All right, so that was the list of benefits and characteristics of having a strong emotional intelligence. The benefit at the top of the list that I shared when we began, that alone is a reason why I have been curious to learn more about emotional intelligence. Let me just repeat that one to you. Not to say that it's the most important one, but I think it's allows you to be more capable of opening the door to learning the skill and letting the other benefits occur naturally. And that item was to be the curator of your own happiness, regardless of outside forces, events, or people. Now, I continue through this journey. I'm still practicing these skills of being emotionally intelligent, and I'm using them and applying them in my personal and also my professional life. I have begun to see remarkable improvements, and the quality of my life has drastically improved. Now, I am probably I will be the only one that sees it initially, but that's really who's going to notice the difference. You will. Your peace of mind, your contentment, your ease with the unknown, your ease with handling different emotions as they pop up. Now, because I have seen such a vast improvement in the quality of my life, simply because I've been trying to incorporate these tools, that is why I wanted to share them with you. Now, I have a list of 8 tools that you can practice to enhance your emotional intelligence, some of which I practice regularly, others that my counselor has suggested, as well as some that I have found online and then began incorporating in my life as well. All of them, I should say, are things that I'm trying to incorporate or have incorporated into my life. But as far as the source, I'm sharing things that I have already worked for me, but I'm also sharing ideas that have come from other sources and now I am using and saying, thank you for sharing this with me. Anyway, and I want to share them with you and give you this valuable resource that I think will make a magnificent improvement in your life, no matter where you are on this journey of emotional intelligence. So let's get to the tools. The first one is to reduce negative personalization. What do I mean by that? If you have a tendency to assume the worst when an individual does something that upsets you or confuses you, instead of assuming the worst, in that moment, take a step back. Refrain from jumping to a conclusion. Usually they're negative assumptions that we jump to in those situations. And instead, examine the situation from multiple perspectives. By taking a step back, you are enabling a more objective perspective. You are giving yourself room to breathe and collect your emotions. And quite often, you're recognizing that what others do more often than not has nothing to do with you. The personalizing, We make it personal, but often has nothing to do with us. And most often, everything to do with them and what they are dealing with, experiencing, and feeling at that time. So it's really about taking a pause before you would jump to a conclusion. So practice reducing negative personalization. This reminds me of the Four Agreements, the book by Don Miguel Ruiz. And one of those is to not take things personally. And I think that is hard to do initially, but when we start to really step back and say, whoa, this isn't about me, remove ourselves from the situation and just observe and try to understand what that other person may be going through, we reduce unnecessary pain and suffering on our side of it, and also can be more comforting and present for that person what they need. The next tool is to reduce an all or nothing vantage point. Now, whether it's in relationships, friendship, or romantic partnerships, or at work, provide yourself with a banquet of options. In other words, don't put all of your socializing into one relationship with a friend. Instead, build a handful of strong, healthy friendships. As we've discussed in the past, often having friends in different arenas in our lives for different interests is a way to not burden any one relationship. And it also allows each of our needs to be tended to in a way that works for us, but also works for us to be a better friend to that individual we are friends with. Now, when it comes to our romantic lives, while we may have a romantic partner, we need to be sure to build a life that we love living, whether or not that individual is with us. The individual should add to, not be the sole reason for our contentment. So when you aren't together, you are enthralled with the everyday routines, activities, and work that you are engaged in and have built for yourself. Professionally, give yourself options. If you are considering a job change, instead of applying just to one job, apply to a handful to give yourself options, if nothing else. Or, hey, maybe a dream job hasn't popped up, but you know you're considering moving or changing. Take an interview at a prospective business, even if it's not your dream, but maybe close. And if nothing else, you'll build networking and confidence through the interview process. So, again, try not to view everything through an all or nothing vantage point. Reducing that, giving yourself a broader foundation in all arenas of your life. Just broad enough for you personally. Everyone's is going to be a little different. So you can still have that depth, but also that safety net as well. The third tool to improve emotional intelligence is to learn to manage your stress effectively. First things first, we need to be able to recognize that we are stressed and then identify the triggers that cause it. Then, when we do recognize that we are stressed, to then manage it in a way that is effective. Perhaps physical exercise or simply going outside and getting fresh air and convening with Mother Nature. For others, it may be journaling. There are so many different ways. You individually are going to have something that's going to work for you. Figure out what that is, but initially figure out what it is that stresses you out and also recognize when you are stressed out. Sometimes we get so busy and so engaged with our lives that we forget to take a step back and go, whoa, I guess I am overwhelmed and stressing myself out. We need to be more conscious of that so we can take care of ourselves, our health predominantly, but also our peace of mind so we can really be present. The next tool to work on is to find the courage to discuss difficult emotions when necessary with the right person. So here's a couple of things on this particular tool. Knowing your boundaries and your priorities and values will help first determine when necessary takes place. In other words, when you should have that conversation. Because not all negative emotions and anger need to be shared with the individual who angered you. Often it is a reaction that is due to our expectations and lack of understanding. But there are other times when you must speak up, and knowing the difference is imperative. Second point on this, when you do decide that you must have a discussion about how you feel with those you either work with or are in relationships with, you're wanting them to understand your boundaries and better understand you as an individual. And in order for that to actually have an opportunity to take place, how you communicate is just as important as knowing which conversation to have when. And so, effective communication in these situations begins with a very simple I statement. I feel is a simple conversation starter. Rather than blaming the other person for which we can never fully know why or what prompted their actions, you begin to share what you know for certain, how you felt, and why you felt it. That gives them perspective on you, and it also doesn't put them on the defensive, doesn't blame them. It just says, hey, I felt this way when you did this. I'm not sure why, maybe, but at least I know I felt that way. And identifying that emotion accurately is crucial. So the closer you can get to what you felt, the better. And do so calmly when you're ready to have that calm conversation. So that's the fourth tool, finding the courage to discuss difficult emotions when necessary with the right person. The fifth tool is to become more adept at rebounding from adversity. Running up against unexpected challenges, obstacles, and enduring setbacks is inevitable if we are choosing to forever evolve, learn, and be curious about the world and improving our potential and our position. It is how we respond to each of these that will determine our success moving forward. So, how can we best respond when we are running up against adversity? Well, it begins with asking the right questions. What can I learn from this experience? What are other perspectives and solutions beyond the limited box I have put myself in? What's important right now in this moment? What's important? And also, what can I be thankful for? So those are just a few questions you can ask yourself when you run up against that obstacle and you're just frustrated. You hope that you would be able to glide over it smoothly or not even see it, but you did see it and you did run into it and it did slow you down. So what do you do? What do you do? Handling it well will make a huge difference in your ability to move forward effectively, and that is part of emotional intelligence. The sixth tool is to allow yourself to be vulnerable in personal, intimate relationships. We've talked about being vulnerable, but also setting boundaries on this podcast. We did that last year, which was inspired by Brene Brown. And as we all know, it's not easy to be vulnerable. Opening ourselves up to hurt and potential pain is not easy, but this is why we do it. On the flip side, we cannot experience true intimacy or deep, fulfilling relationships if we do not reveal who we truly are to other people. There's the catch, right? So, how do we know when to be vulnerable, and what does being vulnerable look like? Let's take a look at a list that I have for you. And again, all these lists are on the show notes, the simplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 140. First thing is, don't just be vulnerable to anybody. Make sure you're involved in a healthy relationship with an individual that has the potential to be trusted. And I say potential because you're not going to know absolutely initially if someone is worthy of you being vulnerable. But as you get to know them gradually, you can then gradually allow yourself to be more and more vulnerable. That's the first component of being vulnerable. Number two is to share honest feelings that are supportive, loving, nourishing, and constructive. So when you do have conversations, maybe you're just expressing how you feel about them, or maybe you're having a conversation, an honest conversation. Whatever feedback you're giving, make sure it's not to tear down, but to build up. As well, make sure it's honest. Third, affirm what the individual you are with shares with you by acknowledging what you heard and expressing gratitude for their ability to share. This lets them know they were heard, number one. Number two, it reveals to them a little bit more about what means so much to you. So they're able to, it's like a reflection in the sense of, that you're having that back and forth. There are two people present. They are, revealing what touched them, and that allows them to get to know you better. The fourth is body language and physical touch that is open, respectful, and loving. So, for example, eye contact, hugging, being supportive, touching their arm or putting your arm around their back. And the fifth one is to make requests for connection. This is also known as bidding, 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 and then responding to bidding initiated by those who are in an intimate relationship. And I want to talk about this a little bit because I found this very fascinating. There was a study that was discussed in an article in The Atlantic in 2014. I provide a link to it, and I encourage you to read this article. And researchers discovered that masters in love, those in which two individuals were in a marriage that continued to thrive and exhibited and expressed respect and love toward each partner, they responded, or in the words of the researchers, turned toward bids 87% of the time versus those in disaster relationships, which did so 33% of the time. This was the stark difference between these two groups, the masters in relationships and the disasters, turning toward the bidding. So when your partner makes a bid for your attention, for your time, or is asking for affirmation or asking for involvement, you turn toward them, you acknowledge, you engage with them. You don't ignore, you don't try to push away. Let's talk about this a little bit more. So, what does bidding look like? It could be as grand as engaging in a shared activity together, or it could be as simple as pointing out something beautiful. And the response is your partner acknowledging and commenting positively or supportively about your observation. It can also involve a personalized note, a thoughtful gift, a gesture demonstrating having listened to a previous conversation, or a needed favor. The list goes on. But the key is you are extending a desire to engage, and the bid is returned with attention or appreciation. So, those are 5 different ways that you can allow yourself to be vulnerable in a personal, intimate relationship, which will then help build your emotional intelligence. The seventh way, the seventh tool, I should say, is to improve your emotional vocabulary. Knowing how you feel and how to accurately pinpoint the emotion through words verbally and written as well is a powerful way to improve connection with others and build understanding and enhance your relationships. So maybe you don't like English, but or whatever language it is that you speak with your partner, but really narrowing down and honing down what you're feeling into the most precise word is something that's going to enhance every relationship you are ever in, because that person that hears it will clearly understand what you're feeling, who you are, and that will enhance the understanding. So if nothing else, pick a word of the day and have it delivered to your inbox every day, something to enhance your emotional vocabulary. The last one, speaking of talking, is to pause before you speak. The primary component of exercising emotional intelligence is acting consciously, and that includes speaking. Pausing to find the proper and most accurate, as well as supportive and constructive words, begins to build and strengthen the bond between two individuals. And so, not only is it important that you know what you're going to say as far as saying the right word, but gather your thoughts to make sure it truly is what you meant to say and want to say. Loving, supportive, constructive words are worth waiting for. They don't have to be rushed. They do not have to be rushed. So don't feel you have to speak immediately. Pause, linger, enjoy the silence with your partner or your friend, and invest with the right words and something that you won't regret saying as well. So those are 8 tools you can work on to improve your emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence has been proven to be more vital and a more accurate determinant than IQ when it comes to long-term success in one's quality of life. And the good news is, unlike one's IQ, emotional intelligence is a learned skill, as we talked about at the top of today's episode. It is something that we can practice and improve upon no matter what our age. However, because it is a skill, The Atlantic pointed out in another article in 2014 that it might also be used for nefarious purposes. In other words, once you become extremely proficient at observing and recognizing emotions in both yourself and others, you can use the tools. Some people may want to use the tools to manipulate and self-serve for their own individual selfish benefit. However, I was speaking to a very good friend whose opinion I trust when talking about such topics. And they pointed out something that's worth noting, that if indeed someone is abusing this skill, emotional intelligence, then are they truly emotionally intelligent? Because to return to the original definition of emotional intelligence, it involves a vast amount of empathy. In other words, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So maybe that Atlantic was a little bit off course, but it's food for thought. Life continues to reveal to me that quality is something that doesn't just occur. It is cultivated, it is conscious, it requires consistency. Yes, it might be helpful if the improvements in our lives could occur by simply buying a particular product or a certain type of home or outfit. But the reality is, no matter what clothes we wear, what size our home is, or what type of degree we have earned, knowing how to understand our emotions and observe them accurately in others, followed by healthy action that respects who we are as well as those around us, is the yeast of life. If you want to rise, if you want what you value to rise, invest in your emotional intelligence. Because when you do, beautiful moments in the everyday, whether we are with others or in our own company, will regularly manifest. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I sure enjoyed putting it together. Again, it's something that I am still and always probably will be in the progress of improving upon and exercising that muscle, but it does get easier with time. And I'll provide a link again to all the articles that I mentioned, that EQ quiz as well, and the sources that I use, which I pulled for a handful of different articles. And so you can find all of those on the show notes, the simplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 140. And I will see you back in just a few to discuss this week's petit plaisir. All right, so this week's petit plaisir is not really anything you're going to want to buy, although it might inspire you to do and go out and buy something. But it has to do with a long winter that we are, or I shouldn't say that, it's inspired by the long winter that we are in the middle of here in the Pacific Northwest. We had a ton of snowfall, record-breaking snowfall in January, and there's still a ton on the ground. And granted, we haven't had snowstorm the last week or two, but it's still around, and it's really changing the habits, the daily routines that we enjoy doing here, getting outside, things like that. So what do you do? And sometimes you don't even recognize that it affects your mood, but it does. And so I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal this last weekend, and it's titled "The Power of a Dose of Nature," and I'll provide a link to it in today's show notes. And they talk about how even when we may not consider ourselves an outdoor person, by getting outside unconsciously, we improve our peace of mind, our happiness levels rise. In fact, a study was done just to this effect, and I'll read you what the findings were just in case you aren't able to read the article. They basically found, after they crunched a bunch of numbers, that people are least happy at work or while sick in bed, and most happy when they're with friends or lovers. But here's the thing. One of the biggest variables, and I'm reading this verbatim from the article, one of the biggest variables for their subjects, who tended to be young, employed, and educated, was where they were when they were happiest. They were significantly happier outdoors, especially in natural settings, than they were indoors, even when the researchers tried to control for the effects of being at work. So the thing is, even when we don't know it, just being exposed to the outdoors for a moment has a profound effect on our moods. So in general, the more time you spend in nature, the better you will do on measures of vitality, wellness, and restoration. And I'll end with a quote that they shared to conclude the article. It's a quote from John Muir, and he says, "Come to the woods, for here is rest." Now, there's a lot of ways you can do this. Obviously, it depends on where you live. But one simple thing that I've done, and I shared a post on my Instagram feed a couple weeks ago, is I have a bird feeder outside my backyard. And this is the first time that I have kept my bird feeder full year round, and it has brought so much pleasure. Watching the birds frolic every morning, seeing them getting nourishment during these cold winter times makes me smile. And so when I trudge out there to the bird feeder to fill it up, even if it's just that short little moment, it makes me smile. It makes me so happy. And I know that may sound overly simple, but that's really the point. That's what nature does. It makes us appreciate how amazing the simplicity of Mother Nature is. And because it's so simple, how it can be so powerful in our lives. And that is just a moment of awe where you just pause and just think about all the little details that are right there. I mean, the birds, I have little, and I don't know what the names of the birds are, but I have big birds and little birds, and it's fun to watch them. And I have no control over them. All I can do is try to bring them food. And when I don't, they don't come. but it's something to think about. If you're not someone who goes out and goes skiing or hiking in the woods or wants to drive on icy roads to get to those trails, how about a bird feeder? Something like that. Something like that. So just some inspiration during our winter months here in the Northern Hemisphere as we make our way into February this week. I hope you've enjoyed this week's Petit Plaisir, where each week ideas are shared to make the everyday all the more enjoyable. Tune in at the end of each Monday's podcast where I'll recommend a book, a film, or a recipe, anything that is a simple pleasure to satiate your sophisticated taste. Thank you for tuning in to the Simple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. For more ideas and inspiration throughout the week, stop by the blog, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com, or pick up the book, Choosing the Simply Luxurious Life, A Modern Woman's Guide. To stay caught up on the most recent podcasts, blog posts, and receive exclusive news as well as an extra dose of inspiration, subscribe to the Simply Luxurious Life's weekly newsletter, which arrives in your inbox each Friday to enjoy with a hot cup of tea or your morning coffee, just in time to jumpstart the weekend. Until next Monday, I'm your host, Shannon Ables. Bonne journée!